Research Lecture. Our speaker today is Professor Lloyd Armstrong. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. He was our provost for over 10 years, and the preeminence that USC has had in many fields was initiated, directed, and actually guided by him. He was the senior vice president at USC, and he holds the high rank of university professor. He is a professor in the College of Letters, Arts and Sciences and in the Rosier School of Education. He has written several books and technical papers, and the topic of his talk today is a creative university in a flat world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to come and speak to you all on one of the subjects that's very interesting to me, the role a university can play in a rapidly globalizing world. I'd first of all, though, just like to thank the whole organizing committee of these Templeton Lectures for having invited me to come and speak and given me this wonderful opportunity. So thank you all. Tom Friedman, in his bestseller, The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century, describes a new world in which rapid advances in technology, particularly communication technology, dropping tariffs worldwide, and a few other effects, have changed the way business is done globally. And in particular, he talks about a world in which corporations create global supply chains for service and products, where they look around the world for the places that can provide the best service at the least expensive cost. As a consequence, companies in China and India and Peru and Indonesia are able to compete for a spot in this global supply chain equally with companies that are in the United States. In other words, the playing field has been flattened. According to Friedman, the world has become flat. If indeed you read some of the research that's going on in the business world, however, you find that this picture is not quite true. It turns out that there are a number of centers. There are bumps in this flat world. There are centers where particular, it seems, creativity resides, particular effectiveness resides in the corporate world. John Hagel and John Seely Brown call these local ecosystems that amplify capability building opportunities, and Suzanne Berger at MIT calls these local clusters, and Richard Florida at North Carolina State calls them learning regions. These are centers of creative activity of one sort or another. And in other words, companies that are located in these creative centers retain an edge in competitiveness over similar companies that are not located in another one of these special ecosystems somewhere else in the world. For many of these local ecosystems, but interestingly not all, there is a university that provides sort of a center of creativity for the region, which provides special characteristics. Thus, the ability of a university to encourage and support creativity turns out to be really key to its role in such a special ecosystem. Now, clearly, I want to focus on those ecosystems where there is a university at its core. But again, I'd really like to emphasize that it's important to recognize that a lot of these don't have a university at its core. Indeed, the relationship between a university and its community is enormously complex. And it's very, very difficult to explain exactly in a sort of scientific fashion what the relationship is, but we'll try to talk about it. And it's also important to note that there are many institutions, many universities that we would all recognize as being among the most creative institutions that have no such ecosystem around them. So we want to try to tease out some of those components. And I'll return at the end of the discussion to this particular relationship between the university and its surroundings. But since creativity in the university is sort of key to what I want to talk about, let me talk about creativity and see where it comes from, what it's all about, and how it can be stimulated. Now, for most of us, I suspect that our sort of feeling about creativity is sort of like our relationship to fine art. We don't quite know how to define it, but if we see it, we're pretty sure we've seen it. Well, if that's all there was, then this would be a short talk and we could all go home. We're very fortunate that the world is filled with academics who've actually studied this in great detail, and so there's an enormous amount of data out there about creativity and how to make it happen. In particular, I want to talk about what's called, quite reasonably, creativity with a capital C. It's not the creativity of every day. The dinner last night was very creative. You behaved very creatively in diffusing that argument between your two colleagues. That happens every day, and clearly our lives are made better by it. I'm not trying to downplay it, but instead I'd like to talk about the creativity that changes our society in some fundamental way. There are a lot of authors who've looked at this with a lot of different viewpoints, different perspectives, many definitions. There are, however, some concepts that seem to be in common, and that's obviously what I will try to touch on. Many of you who know more about creativity than I do will recognize in my presentation a lot of the organization of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which he used in his book Creativity, Flow of the Psychology and the Psychology of Discovery and Invention. He uses a systems approach to creativity, which lets him immerse creativity in a larger question, which then allows him to address some very important questions, such as why does creativity appear at this time, in this place, in this field, and not at that time, in that place, at that field. And I think that's a very important set of questions that we're going to want to talk about. A central component of creativity is that it's not the same as originality. It's not simply a new idea, but creativity at its heart is an interaction between an idea and society. And this is the system that we have to think about. Csikszentmihalyi looks at the question of creativity with a capital C in terms of the memes of society, the units of information that are passed from one individual to another individual. The sum of those memes make up our culture and our society. And he talks about ideas that come in and change one of those memes in such a way that the changed meme is accepted by some large part of society. And that changed meme then itself changes society, just as a changed gene in our bodies changes what our bodies do. And such a gene, such a changed meme, the idea that led to that is called a creative idea. So a creative idea does not stand alone. It's part of a process in society. In fact, in this systems approach, there are three components to the system. The first of them is the domain. Now, the domain is the set of knowledge consisting of some set of rules and procedures. For example, a domain could be mathematics, history, filmmaking, politics. But these domains are sort of fractal-like, so you can drop down to a lower set of domains. Instead of history, it could be American history. Instead of mathematics, it's algebra. Or you could drop down even another fractal level to aircraft design in a particular corporation. And in principle, this approach enables one to analyze the creative capability of each of those domains. The domain is, of course, the thing that gets changed by a creative idea. The second component of this system is the field. The field in this term is the set of gatekeepers of the domain. It's some set of individuals who basically can say, yep, this is a good new idea to accept into the domain, or nope, this is not going in. Any idea has to be accepted by somebody, something. And we'll talk about examples of this. And the third component of the system is, of course, the person or the group that comes up with the idea. It's these three things working together as a system that create a creative idea. And if they don't work together, as Arietti said in his book, Creativity, the Magic Synthesis, as he discusses the creative idea, he says, while it uses methods other than those of ordinary thinking, it must not be in disagreement with ordinary thinking, or rather, it must be something that sooner or later ordinary thinking will understand, accept, and appreciate. Otherwise, the result would be bizarre, not creative. So the difference between a bizarre original idea and a creative original idea is its acceptance by the field. And interesting enough, this word bizarre seems to be a term of art in studies of creativity because it reappears over and over again exactly in this context as an idea that has been rejected by the field. Now let me begin by focusing on the last of these three components, the person who is going to come up with an idea that gives us something creative, before we turn to a discussion of the role of the domain and the role of the field. Almost always the person who comes up with a creative idea is someone who has mastered the domain, understands the domain, understands the rules of the domain, understands the organization of it, and almost invariably enjoys playing in the domain. In particular, this person has internalized the criteria used by the field to accept ideas and reject ideas. Otherwise, in choosing an idea to work on, this person would come up with one which is bizarre rather than creative. Now, the person must also be able to get access to the field, the decision makers. A creative person cannot simply hide in a closet. The idea won't be accepted by the field under those conditions. Now, you can ask, is there a test that will tell us who's going to be creative? Can I pass something out and we'll check and see who in this audience is creative? That actually was sort of the question that was brought to USC during the Second World War by the Air Force. They asked one of our faculty, J.P. Gilbert, to see if he could design a test for creativity which would enable them to pick pilots who would be able to respond creatively to emergencies. And so he did come up with tests and began the whole field of creativity testing. Now, we now know that, in fact, what Gilbert came up with was not a test for creativity, but was a test for divergent thinking. And as we see as we move through, divergent thinking is good, but it is not sufficient. May not be necessary. That's not quite no. So there really aren't any tests that give us a good hold on who can be creative and who won't be. There are sort of sub-tests. We can look at different things. But as you look at the profile of creative people that have been studied, it turns out what you have in a creative person, by and large, is someone who within himself or herself contains a lot of polar opposites, a lot of things that normally do not exist simultaneously in a single individual. Among these are, they should be smart but naive. Now, smart's the first question. How smart do you have to be creative? Well, it turns out from studies that happened long ago that there's sort of a step function in creativity. if you imagine IQ has anything to do with intelligence, which we can talk about at some other point, I suppose, it seems that people below IQ of 120 don't show a lot of creative characteristics. People above do, but there's no further correlation between IQ and creativity. You just need to be kind of smart enough, and that's what's required. But at the same time, you need to be naive. You need to be able to look at problems with a fresh view. And sort of as a child would go. And I have to think that in some ways that's why many of us enjoy teaching. A lot of our students help us with that naive view and help us to step back from something and ask a question we wouldn't have asked at our advanced stage of intelligence. The person should have divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent because they need to come up with a lot of different ideas, but convergent because they need to be able to focus on just a small set of those ideas. They need to be playful and disciplined. A lot of people talk about creativity as sort of throwing a bunch of balls up in the air and seeing which stick to which. You've got to be ready to play with the field, but at the same time, you have to come back with discipline to see what actually works and what doesn't. Extroverted and introverted. It turns out as we go through that one of the most important things is actually interacting with other people to get different viewpoints than your own, get different ideas, and then you've got to make contact with the field, which is a bunch of people. So the extroverted part is very important. But at the same time, this person has to be willing to go into her room and work for 3 months without talking to anybody while they work out the problem. Judging and perceiving. A judging person prefers closure to a problem with the ends tied up. And a perceiving person is very comfortable with ambiguity, likes big ideas, big concepts. They need to be sensing and intuitive. Sensing person likes hard data and concrete facts that are defined by the senses, whereas an intuitive person is, again, comfortable with big ideas, big concepts. Traditional and rebellious. As we said at the outset, they have to have mastered the field. They have to have been accepted the traditional restrictions on the field. But then they have to be rebellious and push back on the edges of the field. So the person is a complex person. And it's not they're halfway in between those poles. They vary from day to day as they go through life. Now let me talk a little bit about the process of creativity that everybody loves to look at. If you read the literature, it's always described as having somewhere between 3 and 10 steps associated with it. Csikszentmihalyi says 5 steps, and they seem to me to be perfectly good steps. So let me just tell you what his steps are. The first step is preparation, analysis of the need, finding a problem. What is the problem that's really exciting? And then, as part of that same first step, going out and getting the background that you need to begin to work on it. Beginning to think about what the possible outcomes could be. What do you need to know? Then there's the famous incubation time. This is a time when you're not consciously thinking about the problem, but things are happening below the level of consciousness in your mind in a nonlinear way. And here I have this wonderful quote by Arrietty again. At work, according at this time, are, quote, ancient, obsolete, and primitive mental mechanisms generally relegated to the recesses of the psyche, unquote. So that's supposed to be going on as you're doing this incubation period. Then after that comes the insight, the aha moment, the eureka. The idea flashes into your mind. You see how the pieces fit together, and you're really happy. And then comes the next step. You have to sit, it's called evaluation. You have to sit and ask yourself whether that wonderful idea is actually worth anything or was just a mirage of some sort. But if you decide that it is, then you go into the last step, which is elaboration, showing that that idea actually works. because the field will not accept it unless you've shown that it works. Edison is famously quoted as having said that creativity is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. This last step, the elaboration, is where the perspiration takes place in the creative process. Now that we've looked a little bit at what happens at the individual level in creativity, I'd like to turn to the question of what the role of the field and the domain are. Because again, I think certainly when I first started looking at all of this, the idea that creativity wasn't something that was abstract, that was out there, was really kind of a shock. But if you look at the literature, it tells us that indeed most people would say, you know, that Bach was creative when he was working. He stopped being creative for 200 years afterward. He was creative again when Mendelssohn rediscovered him, and so on. That creativity is, in fact, an interaction between your ideas and the society. So let's see what that interaction might be. Again, as I said before, I'm going to follow Csikszentmihalyi's work because of his systems approach. I think is very, very important. The important thing to recognize is that the amount of creativity in a field at any given time does not depend completely on the people that are in the field or their originality or their intelligence. It depends on this interaction between the people, the field, and the domain. It depends on the structure of the domain and the structure of the field. Now, what does that mean for the domain? One of the questions is the information in the domain easily obtainable and well organized so that the researcher can find it? Because that was the first step of the creative process, was finding the information. Domains are organized in different ways. In some, the information is really set out there in a pretty straightforward way. In other domains, it's sort of spread over a landscape, and it's harder to know just what's important. I come from a field in physics where, in fact, the information is well organized. You know pretty well what leads to what. It's not true in all domains. Is new knowledge a central focus of the domain? You can imagine a domain that's starting up will focus on new knowledge. It's in a building process. But as a domain matures, it may be that new knowledge becomes less important for that domain, and sort of preserving and manipulating the old knowledge is of more importance. Now, is the system of the domain tightly structured or well less structured? By structure, I mean the rules by which the domain sort of operates, the logic. Is the logic and the rules of the domain clear, strict, universal throughout the domain? Or is the domain made up of a more diffuse system of thoughts where the rules may not be universal throughout the whole thing? Now, the question of structure is very important because if it's tightly structured, things happen differently than if it's loosely structured. A typical tightly structured domain, or two fields in which they're tightly structured, are mathematics and physics. There the rules are very well defined. You know pretty well what the proof of a new idea is and how you reject a new idea. You know, you have a very good idea in those fields what is the subset of knowledge that is known. And you know out there that big space of things that are unknown. Now, that means that information is well categorized, and a young person going into that field is in many ways able to move through the field pretty quickly because it's laid out what they have to know. And if they come up with a new idea, that new idea is recognized quite quickly because, again, a new idea, you know where the boundaries of knowledge are in mathematics and physics. If you go to a less well-structured field, such as many areas in the social sciences, you find they're broader. They're much more nonlinear in a sense. It's not clear that this information leads to that information. It may in some cases lead to this information. So it's a big sort of nonlinear thing with different people with different perspectives. And so it may take much longer for a young person to actually master that domain to the degree that they can make a creative intervention. And it may in fact take the field many years to decide if that new idea is actually a good idea from the perspective of the domain, because in some sense of the nonlinearities of the field. It's just not obvious that this new idea is good until you've seen how it interacts with all the parts, and then you know whether it should be accepted as a brilliant idea or thrown out. Now, how does the field itself help us to change the acceptance of creativity? And I want to talk a little bit about the field itself and what it means, because it's important to point out that the field, as I said before, is any group that acts as gatekeepers to this domain. For example, if you look at Renaissance Florence, when there was a flowering of art, the field was actually a relatively small set of wealthy individuals, governments, and so on, who had decided among themselves, in effect, that they wanted to make Florence a jewel. They determined which artists would get the money to paint something or sculpt something. In fact, they decided to a significant degree what they would paint and what they would sculpt. Artists were told, I want 3 angels in the background of that saint, or my 2 small children should be in the foreground of that. So those people were the real gatekeepers of art. Without their approval, there was no art in Florence. So at that time, the field of art was this small set of people. At other times in other domains, the field becomes those who are experts in the field. Most of us work in fields where, in domains I should say, where we have peer review. And whether we are able to publish or not depends upon what knowledgeable people in the field decide. And whether we get a grant or not depends upon the peer review, knowledgeable analysis of what we have said. So for us in these areas, the field is our professional colleagues. But if you look at an area like politics, well, now there's a complex field. On one hand, you have all the people who will vote. You have lobbyists. You have political parties. You have all sorts of other sources of influence and money. So the field in politics is an enormously complex field. And the fields are not stable in time. They change over time. So the characteristics of the field have a lot to do with whether creativity is going to be associated with a domain. Csikszentmihalyi suggests 3 ways that the field affects creativity. Does it solicit or stimulate novelty? That is, the field itself. We talked a bit about the domain, whether it was interested in new results. But the field itself, the people who are defining the field, have a lot of role. If you go back to Mozart, the time of Mozart, the field again in that case was a bunch of royalty by and large, or well-to-do people, and it was very much in their social interest to be able to have new music performed in their salon by some artist who had just written that piece for them. So the field there, which was the rich people, the royalty, was encouraging people like Mozart to come up with new pieces that could be played. They encouraged creativity. Does the field set a very high or a very low bar for the definition of novelty? There are fields in which only absolutely the very best new ideas are absorbed into the domain, and the rest are rejected by the field. There are other fields in which the field decides any idea that's pretty good we ought to accept into the domain. Now, on the one hand, in the former case, if you let that go too far, your whole field risk to just become stagnant because there are not enough new ideas coming in. And in the latter case, where the bar is too low, you end up with a domain that has too many undigested new ideas. So a healthy field will find some place in between, but the field, in a sense, is one that really decides what it wants to do. And interestingly, the last question he raises is the field connected to society in a way that it's able to tap into the resources of the society? And again, all of you probably know in some circumstances of people who are, you would say, in the field of your domain, who manage somehow to make connections with the government, or connections with foundations, or connections with some source of money. And money comes into the field and in the domain. And others, where you might in an abstract way say, this is just as good a domain as that one. There aren't people in the field who are able to build those relationships with the people who have the money. So there's another interesting component. Now, what you say is the balance between the field and the domain in deciding about creativity. Well, it depends. Again, if you have a well-structured domain, as in physics, the rules of proof are contained in the domain. We know how a new idea in physics is to be tested. We know what will tell us if it is a correct idea or not. It's in the domain. So if you look at the balance of the field and the domain, in fact, the field doesn't get to do much there because the proof is already built into the domain, and the field just sort of says, yep, satisfied the truth. It stands up to experiments. It must be part of the domain. If you go to art, on the other hand, there the domain itself does not have rules of what a new form of art is. It doesn't have rules as to what a new creative kind of art is. It is the people in the field, whether it be artists themselves or the people who pay for it, who make the decision as to whether that new piece of art is in fact creative or is simply bizarre and should be thrown out. So depending upon the structures of the domain and the fields, you see the relative weight of the domain and the field in defining creativity balances. Now, with this brief overview of these three components, let me turn to a more practical question, which is how can the probability of personal creativity be increased? And there are components in what I'm going to say that the person himself or herself can sort of search out. There are other components that really are a function of the organization or of the society. So we'll sort of mix them all together. Again, Csikszentmihalyi's system approach lets us ask some interesting questions or points out some interesting things. One of them, which relates to what we're going to say later, is that place matters. Why does place matter? Well, information is not evenly distributed over the face of the earth. Information itself is clumped, whether it be, for example, the place where the great teachers are. Well, they tend to be in a relatively small number of places. If you want to study agriculture, you don't have to be a genius to know that Los Angeles or New York City are not the right place to go study agriculture. So place has information, place is not even, it's not flat in terms of information. Stimulation is not evenly distributed either. Certain centers, for a variety of reasons, are able to attract more successful risk takers. And risk taking is very closely associated with creativity. And finally, the person has to be able to access the field in order that their work be considered creative. To access the field, they must realize their idea. They have to come up with something that they can sort of hand off to the field and say, here it is. Centers that facilitate realization may not be the same as the centers where there's more information. It may not be the centers where there is a lot of stimulation. It may be the centers of resources, which may be different from all of those. So place has an important thing. Arrietty would add a couple of other components, and that is that the place has to have an openness to cultural stimuli and a tolerance for diverging views. Now, moving to some societal inputs, one of the interesting things that is important in this field, as in many others, is high expectations. High expectations in the family, high expectations in school, and high expectations in the workplace. And of course, always tempered, as one knows, with making sure the expectations for an individual actually match in some way the reality of what that individual can do. At the flip side of expectation, both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards are very important. Interestingly, the research shows that for creative people, by and large, intrinsic rewards are more important than extrinsic rewards. People really do this stuff because they love it, not because they're doing it to be paid, but they like to be paid. So, but leads to a very important caveat to a place such as a university. We have to be sure, and especially in our education, that we do not stifle the intrinsic motivation that our students have by turning an intellectual adventure into a chore. We've got to keep alive that intrinsic motivation that the students have if we want them to leave us as potentially creative people. Something we all know but is worth repeating, having a mentor who is an established member of the field is incredibly important in a young person becoming a creative person in his or her own right. Now, when you think of this as a system, you can understand that, because all the things that you have to do to attract the attention of the field, to meet the measures that the field uses to judge creativity, that stuff's not written down. That stuff is known by the people who are successful in the field. As Merton showed a couple decades ago, the choices the field makes are not always fair in any reasonable sense. He coined the term the Matthew effect. Frank coins the term winner take all. We all think of the rich get richer. But it's a nonlinear process. If the field has judged your work to be creative, you're much more likely that they will judge your next work to be creative than that someone whose work has never been judged as creative will have their next work judged as creative. It's a very nonlinear process. I say it's not fair, but it is something that has been shown to be true in a lot of different fields. So a mentor helps you get into that loop. There's another reason that a mentor is a very important thing. Having the right amount of resources is important. The right amount means enough to sort of get traction on your problem, but not too much, because if you get too much, you're able to take easy solutions to problems, when in fact creativity tends to be squeezed out there into the open by your being forced to get past some obstacle. Now, the Harvard Business Essentials book on managing creativity and innovation reminds us that creativity is a function of three things: expertise, which we've heard about, your critical thinking skills themselves, and motivation. So as they quite reasonably point out, if you really want to get people to be creative, you need to match the person's expertise, critical thinking skills, and intrinsic motivation to the job. You got to get them into a job that they actually love if you want to see the creativity. So creative organizations do a lot of work to try to make sure that their workers get into the closest matched job they possibly can. And one might imagine that one of the things they might say for us in universities is that we need to be sure that we encourage our faculty to follow their interests beyond their departmental or even disciplinary boundaries when the source of their intrinsic motivation moves into a different field. We need to come up with more flexible organizational structures. Individuals seeking to increase their own creativity should look for jobs, not on the basis of, are they going to be, is this a job they can do, but is this a job they would love to do? Now, unfortunately, many times in society, there aren't enough jobs in certain areas of the kind that people would like to do. One goes back to music, composing. There are not so many demands for original music compositions now. Young people who really want to do composition are in a much harder place than they might have been at other generations. And so, according to the systems approach, when that happens, we will see less creativity in particular areas. One of the most important things that business finds is that people must diversify the stimuli that they see by working with or listening to people who come from outside of their own expertise. And so it's important that organizations support and encourage interactions between people with different expertise. In corporations, for example, they find it very, very important to move people around from group to group, not let them sit in just one research group, but after a period of time move them to another group so as to maximize the variety of different stimuli that they see. We need in our organizations to minimize the constraints and maximize the enablers so that people can focus on what it is they want to do. We don't want everyone to feel like they're pulled in 20 directions at all times, because that doesn't work if you're trying to get creativity. And we don't want them to feel mired in some sort of bureaucracy that, again, doesn't let them turn their attention to what their real business is. And a very important thing for us in the university is it is very important that the institution accept and encourage intelligent risk-taking. Creativity does not occur without intelligent risk-taking. And part of encouraging that is that an organization has to lower the personal cost of failure to its workers. And I think this is something we should consider, think about, all of us, for our tenure-track faculty, who are in a situation in which the cost of the personal cost of a failure on a research project can really be quite high. And that is at a time when we should be encouraging creativity. It's something we need to think about. Now, in corporations, group creativity is certainly an important thing. It's becoming increasingly important in universities as we get bigger and bigger grants. And so there's a lot of research in corporations about how do you build a creative group. Well, miracle of miracles, it turns out the way you make a creative group is to get a group of people who, as a group, have the same characteristics as a creative individual. That may seem rational and logical, but there it is. You have to get in your group some convergent thinkers and some divergent thinkers. You got to bring in experts and you got to bring in novices. You got to bring in some introverts and some extroverts, and you can go down that list, and the well-behaved creative group has all of those people in it. And in addition, of course, if it is a group, you can bring people who are coming in with expertise in different domains so that you can actually match expertise to what it is you want to do. Now, of course, in universities, especially as we go into these bigger grants, we're pretty good at bringing together the people who have expertise in the desired domains. But we don't actually pay any attention at all to that which the corporations find is one of the most critical components, and that is whether you have the right personality types in this group so that it makes this sort of creative brew and mixture. And there's some very interesting result on pressure and what it does to creativity, again out of Harvard Business School. They find that pressure stimulates creativity if the people feel they're on a mission. Look at the Apollo spacecraft. Something happens to the Apollo spacecraft. The astronauts are going to die in 3 hours if some unknown problem is not solved. Everybody drops everything, works hard on it. The managers back them off for every other task, and in 3 hours they find it, they fix it, and it's all done. They've done a creative thing that had never been done before. This is what they mean by being on a mission. People who understand why a problem has to be solved quickly, and they buy into the urgency of that. And the management, the people who build a cocoon around them, understand they can't be bothered by anything else while they're doing that. When you do that, pressure increases creativity. On the other hand, if you just increase pressure and people sort of feel like, oh, you know, I'm torn in too many directions, I've got too many problems, their pressure doesn't do anything positive. On the other hand, lack of pressure increases creativity for people who feel they are on an expedition. That's pretty poetic stuff from Harvard Business School, but there you are. If they feel they're on an expedition, that is, they're exploring and generating new ideas rather than trying to fix problems. But if you have people who are just sort of doing everyday stuff over and over, more again, lack of pressure does not increase creativity there at all. Again, something I think we should pay attention to, in particular with our junior faculty, given that there is a lot of pressure associated with the tenure decision, how is that playing into what they can do? So we see creativity as really a complicated function of a lot of things. Where it appears depends upon a very nonlinear interaction. Domains change over time, fields change over time. Focus of funding may shift. Creativity supporting funding, for example, may shift from universities to industry back to universities. And by creativity supporting, I mean funding that's big enough to get traction and is set up in such a way that people can devote their attention to the problem rather than having to spend all their time on something else. All right, now that we know everything about creativity, let me return to the question which I left unaddressed. This idea of there being special places in this flat world where things happen and that universities may be part of it. How does a creative university, let's assume we're creative, interact with its surroundings to make one of these bumps? That turns out to be an enormously complex question, and I have to say I don't have an answer. There are large-scale studies of the impact of universities on their surrounding areas. And in the end, the answers that come out are not clear. And they're not clear, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is in order to get large data sets that people feel comfortable with in a statistical manner, they have mixed together enormous sets of apples, oranges, and plums. Secondly, most of the data sets predate the enormous globalization we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years and the enormous growth of the knowledge economy. So I'll try to come up with some statements, but some of them are statements on faith, and so I might as well say that at the outset. A lot of the information comes out of case studies on how businesses are responding to globalization. Hagel and Brown point out that these special ecosystems grow up around companies that have complementary activities and a need to share knowledge. But it takes more than just the companies. The companies have to be embedded in a region in which there are the other things they need. That is, there are law firms, there are public relation firms, there are human relation firms. They have to be in a system, in a situation in which there is transportation in which the government is stable and all of these things. So it takes a special set of things coming together. Berger notes that universities can be important in creating communities where, quote, intense face-to-face exchanges of knowledge are important, unquote, such as Silicon Valley. And there is a recent article by Goldstein and Drucker that really puts together, first of all, describes a lot of the previous research in some detail, does a big, huge calculation, tries to come up with conclusions. Steve Sample will love it because every time they start looking at their results, they say, these results are actually kind of counterintuitive. And indeed, most of their results are, and I think one has to look at them with some concern, but whatever. Since creativity stimulates creativity, it's not surprising that some of the metrics that you can have for a university that reflect creativity, such as patents, research funding, and so on, seem to have a positive effect on the surrounding region. But it turns out to be an enormously complex set of results which are not simple at all. Since you clearly need creative people to make a creative infrastructure, it stands to reason that the number of graduates that a university turns out, and in particular their focus on technology and business, should have an impact. And in fact, that's one of the clear things that comes out of these studies. It's a very positive impact. We think in Southern California that our graduates don't go far. They stay close. Well, it turns out that happens most places. Sort of the transfer of students from one place, from where they graduate, to other areas is not as high as you'd think it is. And so that's an important role of the university. I don't know if any study looks at what seems to me must be a very important parameter, which is how welcoming is the university to the idea of participating in the building of this ecosystem. That is, how welcoming is the university to working with the companies that want to come in? How welcoming is it to the community to get together and build something? I would think that must be important, but I know of no study that's looked at it. And as I say, the data show that all regions that have these things that you would think would work together, they don't actually work together. There's some very interesting studies by Richard Florida that indicates that it has a lot to do whether the community itself is open to creativity. Is it open to diversity and to a wide variety of social and cultural options? Can the community itself attract and keep the creative workers it needs to have to become one of these ecosystems? Now, obviously, universities can play a significant role in trying to create this atmosphere of openness, but it's a very, very complex process. As Florida notes in his conclusions, and I quote, many regions lack the talent and the tolerance to compete at the cutting edge. And that's an interesting new component, which has just been studied by a few people. It was brought up 7 or 8 years ago as a possible important thing. But the whole idea of sort of the openness of the broader community to different ways of thinking about things is turning out to be, looks like, a more important thing. In any case, Florida suggests that a major role of universities in the future must be much more engagement with the community in order to try to build this atmosphere of tolerance that will in turn attract more creative people. So just in any case, it's clear that the well-being of the nation in this time of rapid change, globalization, and so on, will depend on our ability to build and sustain these learning regions, these local ecosystems of creativity that actually prevent the world from becoming flat. Universities, in order to be part of that game, need to assure that we're doing absolutely everything we can to enable our faculty and our staff to be creative themselves. We need to do everything we can to assure that our graduates are intellectual risk takers who have learned how to connect the dots before they leave us. We need to be part of the community, working to increase the tolerance and the acceptance of difference. And in addition, we need to see our role as one of active partnerships to companies that can be attracted into our area that are working at the cutting edge of their domains. Indeed, one can imagine that as the knowledge economy continues to grow in importance, that the importance of those intense face-to-face exchanges of knowledge that Berger talks about will in fact become more important themselves, and that the universities will become more important in being the glue that holds these ecosystems together. And that will open up exciting new opportunities for global influence for those universities that learn how to position themselves at the center of a local ecosystem of creativity. Thank you very much.
Floor is open for any questions or comments? Questions?
Lloyd, I've been interested in societies where trust prevails and those that where it doesn't. There's been a lot written in recent years about high trust societies, low trust societies. The example of the question is whether or not environments, communities, ecosystems that are more self-confident, secure, supportive are more stimulative of creativity, or in fact whether or not those that are under stress lead people to be exploring greater solutions that are creative. Any thought or reflection?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think you can find examples of both of those. That is, there are places in China right now where enormously creative systems are being built up with tremendously competitive corporations coming up in a system where, you know, trust sort of system-wide is not there. That is, trust for the banking system is not there. Trust for the government is not. I mean, there are a lot of elements of non-trust there. On the other hand, you continue to see, resurgence of some of our traditional areas in the United States, the Silicon Valley, the Boston area, and so on, which are very, very different and remain creative to this day. So I think, again, what all the research that I've read shows is an enormously nonlinear process in which trying to say this will create that doesn't really happen, and that's that's why it's a little hard to see exactly what the next step is. But I think you can sort of imagine some best practices. Clearly, trust at a certain level, at least among the people in this community, has to be there, or people will not share information. And if information is not shared, then you don't go anywhere. But how that relates to trust for the institutions, trust for people who are outside of the community, again, I don't think there are data that would indicate anything about that. John.
Yeah, as you were talking, I'm thinking that for many scholars, I suspect if you were to ask people what they see as their community, it goes far beyond sort of a local ecosystem, especially as the local communication proliferates. And so, in there somewhere, I mean, I can see the value of building up an institution with connections that foster creativity. But in terms of communities that people deal with, the other side of globalization is that the community is not local anymore.
Yeah.
It's disconnected. I just wonder if you could comment on how those two things fit together.
Well, of course, the field has seldom been local. The field in general, as I say, you can go fractally down, and so the field in Florence was in Florence. But if you if you move up and you ask what is the field of art or the field of history or of physics, it is in fact a global field, and those of us who are in the field have connections to everybody. And so you're actually asking an interesting question, which really I think has surprised people as they have begun to do these studies. There was a feeling that sort of the description that Friedman gave of the flat world was so persuasive that it must be right. And, you know, just in the same sense that you as a psychologist interact with a psychologist in China just as well as you do one down the way. As Friedman quite reasonably explained it, as a businessman you can now interact as easily with someone in China as someone here. So as they actually began to do the studies, they were surprised to see that wasn't what was happening. That in fact these ecosystems were building up, and that in the end that face-to-face interaction seems to give an edge that you can't quite get through email and you can't quite get through these other things. It lets you do something which you as a psychologist we should challenge to explain. But as I say, it has been interesting to a lot of the people in the business arena to see that globalization is not playing out as one scenario, but as a trillion scenarios.
Yeah, I think those of us in universities would have a sense of these centers. You mentioned a couple of Boston's built around universities, but you mentioned in your comments about many that weren't built around those. Could you sort of comment on a couple of your favorite?
Well, again, most of the places in China, a good example, are not built around universities at all. They are built around some set of industries. There are places. Well, I'm just trying to think in the U.S. I think most of the ones I can think of in the U.S. Are built around universities to one degree or another, and I think. Pardon? Well, that's a very good example. Bell Labs itself was not built around a university. It was a standalone institution. It was clearly one of the most creative institutions. Xerox PARC, now that you've gotten me going, is only sort of peripherally close to a university and wasn't built up because of that university. So there have indeed been IBM, Yorktown Heights. There are a number of corporate labs that served in a sense as the intellectual center. That is, they themselves were playing an almost university-like role. They had the smart people. They were throwing ideas out right and left, and there was always room for other companies to come in and sort of pick up some of the stuff that they were throwing out, even with questions of patents and so on. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the relationship. Well, if we focus on the ecosystem itself, raises some questions about, for example, private versus public universities, the relationship to the broader ecosystem as a whole. And I'm sort of two minds. Maybe I've got this polarity within me that you encourage, but I'm
yes,
good. Two minds on that. On the one hand, on the one hand, having private universities operating within such an ecosystem compels those within the university community to engage the community at large, partly for financial reasons, etc. But that might lead to this kind of ferment and enrichment. On the other hand, there's a danger that right in near the end of your talk, you sort of spoke about firms who were on the cutting edge and everything, and who would value being associated with the university, and that was making me think in terms of, well, developing more of a kind of a client consulting kind of relationship rather than something that was of this larger ecosystem sort of ferment. And so I see it cutting both ways. I'm wondering if you think, on balance, which way does that work?
It's a very good question, and let me circle back for just a moment and answer a little bit more the question you asked, because there are some other ecosystems which are very, very different. For example, the ecosystem in which very expensive clothing is built in Italy. It's an unusual place. The Italians are still making clothing in Italy. High cost, high labor cost, but there is in fact an infrastructure for the building, for the making of clothing there. Trades, and there is the set of creative people in the clothing industry who are not academics in any sense whatsoever. So there needs to be a source of creativity. It's the design houses that become the creativity in Italy. So it doesn't have to be a kind of intellectual activity that we typically think of here. Now, coming back to your question, that's why I said the companies that are at sort of the cutting edge of their domains, there are whole sets of industry that we don't want to interact with anyway, because that's not what we do. And I would think that we would be looking in interactions for the same thing that we look for now, which is synergies, ways in which not a client type of interaction, but an interaction, a relationship in which both parties benefit. That is, we get something out of them, they get something out of us. This raises enormous questions of conflict of interest, which are obviously there. But I think questions of conflict of interest and handling conflict of interest is the future, and there's no way around it. So I don't think we're looking for a client relationship. I think we're looking for a synergistic relationship.
If I could
Yes, please tweak that.
Just to tweak the question a little bit, that to the extent that it's the sort of the ecosystem as a whole, that also suggests questions of sort of civic governance of who manages. I mean, do we expect such ecosystems to emerge on their own? And if not, whose place might it be? Are there lessons to be drawn from this literature in terms of what is the nature of management? It may be that places with good amenities or some other aspect is in fact might be key.
Yeah, and yes, and I would say good amenities are important, modulo that it is good amenities for the region. So in some of these Chinese areas, you might not think the amenities are good, but the people in China thinks that's a pretty nice place to be. I think there are examples of both models. For example, a Silicon Valley or a Route 128 to a significant degree grew up without any sort of planning. It just happened. There were ideas there. There were entrepreneurs who said, I'm going to set my building down here. But if you look at the research triangle in North Carolina, that really was a thought-out process in which three institutions said, what can we do to begin to make this into a different region? And so they brought in the governmental agencies in that area and so on. So there was a situation in which the governance, if you will, transcended the players, whereas the Silicon Valley, in a sense, was governed by the players. So I think it can happen in any way, and certainly, again, from what I've read of the things that are building up in China and India, by and large, it is the players who are defining that as they find around the country who they want to play with, and then they go sit there, rather than the government being smart enough to say, we're building a research park here. There has been a very spotty history around this country of built research parks doing anything. Most of them fail. And in many ways it's because I think the dynamics, as I said, are so nonlinear. It's hard to know exactly what the critical thing is. The best idea is to let it grow up. Yeah, Anne?
I was wanting you to draw on your experiences as provost here and talk to us about how And that kind of position, that person in that organization can help foment creativity. And does there need to be kind of a top-down approach, bottom-up approach, or some mixed model? Or?
Well, I think what, again, I will not try to, I'll try to give an answer that doesn't try to either defend prior record or suggest actions to the current administration. But I think a number of things that I talked about are clearly things that can be stimulated within the organization. This idea that people have to work on what they love means we can't stop people at the boundaries of their department. And it is very important that we find ways to let people transcend the limits of their border as they're following their research and their interests. And that's a hard thing to do because departments have their obligations, they have to make things happen, they hired you to do a job, etc. But I think setting up procedures that enable faculty to follow their interest in some way that doesn't wipe out their department is one way to really help them be more creative. Secondly, as I said, industry really says that what they see is that you've got to talk to people who aren't in your field. And the university has gotten a lot more interdisciplinary over the last few years, people talking to folks from other fields. But I think that's a road you want to keep going down. You want to keep people talking with other people. Now, one of the difficulties we've always had at this university is getting people from different fields to sit in one room when there's not sort of money on the table if they'll do so. And so I'm delighted to see so many people from different fields here at this evening. But this is hard to do in a university where everybody is so busy. And yet, it would probably stimulate a lot more creativity if faculty could somehow carve out a little time to hear some talks about fields where they don't know much. So I think it's things like that. And as I said, at our student level, I think it's really, really important that we help to teach them the desirability of taking intellectual risks. I had a friend who was provost at a very prestigious institution in this geographic area that has SATs that are much higher than ours. And this friend said, our students are not creative. They've never taken a chance in their lives. In order to get these enormously high SATs, in order to never get a B in their life, they never took a chance. I think we have to be careful as we push our SATs up that we're getting more and more students who come to us without ever having taken an intellectual chance. And I think it's incumbent on us to sort of push them into a more chance-taking mode. And similarly, the whole idea of critical thinking, connecting the dots, I think is absolutely central to what our output needs to be. And I think if we focused on that, it would help us a lot. Turn it over.
I have a question in terms of being a business person and having read The World is Flat, and we know the thinking of a global economy, and the next part of business that comes to my mind is philanthropy and not-for-profits. And when you talked about the creative people being, amongst other characteristics, traditional and rebellious, I was thinking about Bill Gates, and then I was thinking about his new partnership with Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
And Warren Buffett is certainly a traditional business person. And Warren Buffett has chosen to give his vast fortune to now create the largest philanthropic endeavor in the history of the United States with sort of a borderless society, focusing on A World is Flat on global issues. Is that an exception, or is that sort of the creative mind that has used the private sector to create wealth and then redeploy some of those characteristics of creativity to philanthropy and look at a more global society?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I don't see anybody here from our Center for Philanthropy, so I will feel free to answer it however I would like. I think it's a very important question. Traditionally, of course, philanthropy has been very local in the sense that people who made their money in America have tended to give most of their money in America. And in some ways what we're seeing with Gates is, I suspect, the beginning of a new generation of philanthropists who are perhaps going to think in a different way. I don't really know. You know, talking to people in particular the public health community, they are enormously impressed by some of the ways in which Gates is using that money. And obviously Buffett looked at it and was impressed as well and decided to use the rebellious part of Bill Gates to distribute the money while he stuck with the traditional component of his. I think it's an interesting question. If in fact Gates manages to do some of the things in the health area, global health area, that he is trying to do, I think it will set an enormously powerful example to others. If, on the other hand, the money just sort of sinks into a black hole and there's nothing that comes out of it, then I think there'll probably be a drawing back and asking, you know, maybe I've gone to a place where I didn't really understand the situation well enough and I tossed it away. So I think this may well be an experiment which could have enormously important outcome for what happens as a lot of these very, very rich people move down their career path to the point that they're ready to become philanthropists. But I don't know the answer. But it clearly is, as you said, to some extent Friedman is clearly right, it's a flat world. It is interesting that Gates seems to be trying to give most of his money in ways that could not in any way be, or perhaps I should say, it is a little hard to say he's doing this for personal gain. That is, he's not using it in a donation to something that he's going to be able to sell to later on. But he's putting his money in a lot of health care where nobody else wants to invest money. So it's an interesting question.
Sometime 15 years ago, one of our colleagues, I think it was Doyle Myers from SPPD, introduced me to a book that I forgot the name of the author, but I could visualize it in my bookshelf. It's a green cover book. It had two authors, Creative Marginalism or Marginal Creativity. And the main thesis of this book was, as you mentioned, but I want you to elaborate a little bit on your concept of domain and field. This book said that really all the creative thinking, all the creative ideas, they come on the intersection of the disciplines, not in the mainstream. And I remember they said all the creative ideas are at the boundaries, not in the main body of any discipline. And it even pushed the idea a little further to a more radical thing. They said the only way that you could have creativity is having an interdisciplinary structure. And the other side of that, it says that any disciplinary structure would not promote creativity, but also would stifle it. My question is, and again, you address that beautifully, how could that be achieved in a disciplinary environment, which is a typical university with its tenure, promotion, a structural system?
Well, first of all, let me just push back a little on the concept. There certainly are people that I have read who would emphasize that creativity is most likely to occur at some intersection between different fields. I think Csikszentmihalyi very carefully has a definition that doesn't say that, because what he is looking at is things that change the ideas by which our society works. And a lot of those ideas are part of a discipline. As the disciplinary boundaries move back, he would say those are creative ideas that have pushed back the boundaries. So in many ways, as you've probably understood from my talk, if you understood anything, is that creativity is in many ways a defined concept. And so you can argue it is whatever you have defined it to be. There is no doubt that, as everyone knows who's dealt with me over the last 12, 14 years, I have always really pushed this idea of trying to do interdisciplinary things, because I think that's where we see a lot of exciting stuff. But I think we would be enormously wrong if we said that there wasn't going to be exciting stuff within the disciplines and that there wasn't going to be creativity within the disciplines. Again, I think we need to go back to what several of these authors keep emphasizing. You get creativity when people are doing something they love. If what they love is something in a discipline, then we should not try to discourage that. If what they love is something that's wandered a little bit outside of the edge of the discipline into another discipline, then we should enable them to do that. And I think that's really what we're looking for. We're looking for the flexibility in the workplace, which is our university, where people aren't tied down by their disciplines, but are able to do what they really love doing.
Well, firstly, I do want to thank you over the years for your support of interdisciplinary work. I want to tease you before I come to my serious point, and that is that I've learned from you that we must be at the cutting edge so that we can connect the dots and provide the glue that holds the ecosystem together. So
precisely. So you did the whole talk there in 2 sentences.
I just want you to know I was
That's what you
paying
always
attention.
do. I mean, you cut right to the bottom.
This was so stimulating. There are so many things, and I'm glad we'll have opportunities to discuss in the future. But I just want to focus on one thing. That is that the sort of creativity you've talked about is the one for which I think Silicon Valley is the model. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of success that is very much a flat earth success. But as someone who reads novels, I'm also very much aware of the round earth successes. When I'm looking for novels, I'm not looking for flat earth novels which flatten out all differences between cultures. I'm looking for ones that are culture specific. And that sort of notion that there is a community which creates a cultural scene that is creative and by its very individuality is creative rather than its global competition. To the extent that it does have a global impact, it's because people come to visit that cuisine, as it were. Do you want to say something about that sort of creativity, or is that just outside your remit?
No, I will make a comment on it. You know, as one who has been visiting France sort of consistently over the last 40 years, and who has watched the culture being slowly washed away as the McDonald's move in and the American television is shown on here. I think that's a lovely world you describe, and I hope we continue to have some level of cultural differences between countries. But it's already clear they're not as strong as they once were, and I regret that myself. And I do think, again, as one moves around different countries, you do see very different cultural viewpoints and approaches to the question of creativity. Different societies have different expectations for how creative their citizenry is going to be. For example, in many societies, the society basically constructs itself with the idea that only the elite can be creative and nobody else can. You know, that's what we saw in China until very recently, and suddenly they discovered, no, there's creativity at all levels and they've got to educate people. So there's a lot of cultural baggage, or not baggage, but a lot of cultural richness associated with creativity. And different kinds of creativity, I think, are more likely to happen in different kinds of cultural things. Just as we say, there may be cultures that support music much better than a hard-nosed engineering type of culture, and so on.
And I had a related issue, contrasting the Silicon Valley effect around Stanford and what I think has been the situation for us, where, for example, engineering has long had very strong ties with aerospace. Yes. That weakened. Now we have immense ties with the cinematic arts, as they're now called. And that got me to thinking about the sort of happenstance there, that in some sense it isn't that we created Hollywood, but rather that by a quirk of history, our expertise in aerospace and engineering placed us in a unique position to create a synergy as we move from the world of movies to the world of interactive games and so on. And then that got me to thinking about, but look how different Bollywood is from Hollywood. Yeah. And this sort of circle of ideas where you see both the globalization effects and the very distinct local cultural effects.
Yeah.
It's sort of intriguing.
Well, this Suzanne Berger at MIT, who did a study of how corporations were actually responding to globalization, said if you wanted sort of a one-sentence descriptor of what made the successful companies, it was that they understood what their heritage was and that they built on it. And their heritage was sometimes their location, sometimes, it was whatever was special about them. And so I think what you're saying is similar in a sense. Where we are is part of our heritage. And if we succeed in building one of these ecologies, it will be because we pick up on what our heritage is. That is, heritage in a broad sense of what's around us, where the other strengths are. And if we were to ignore that, we would be quite stupid indeed. But I think that's one of the reasons that it is so difficult in these studies to pick up the relationship between a university and the creation of one of these ecologies. Because in fact, every situation is different. For some universities, just as you say, they happen to have around them a couple of areas that fit in with what they did, which turn out to be important areas. For other universities, there isn't that sort of industry around them, or maybe there's an industry. Maybe they were really good in steel, making steel, and it just turned out that wasn't the right thing. So I think that's the difficulty in really drawing a firm conclusion about this is what the university should do next about building this ecology. It's a very, very complex, nonlinear thing.
One more question.
Yeah, you pointed out that in the social sciences, succeeding is more drawn out than in the measuring sciences. How many years or decades will you give yourself to decide if you've succeeded as provost? Because measuring-wise you have, but then there are maybe other considerations.
I think I'll be long dead before anybody figures out. But at least if depends upon the metrics, of course, that one uses for success. Getting invited to speak here as a metric for success tells me that I have already achieved success. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's go to the next room where we have a small reception.
Well,